Well, Greg, did I ever tell you about the time I went and watched a race with Jeff Gordon's pits?
I don't think I've heard that story, Jackie.
What? I've never told you. That's hard to believe.
We didn't even know you liked NASCAR that much, Jackie.
I really don't. I just think it. Don't tell nobody. I try to be a gearhead, but and there is or is no truth to the fact that I've been 130 miles an hour on everything, but not.
Hey, I'm Greg Honeycutt, the Family Consumer Science Agent in Harnett County.
And I'm Jackie Hilton, the 4-H agent here in Harnett County. So, Greg, we're doing the Farm to Fork camp, and today's our second day. What are we cooking?
What we're going to cook today is we're actually going to make a zucchini fritter, and we're going to make some homemade salsa. What do you think about that?
That sounds delicious. A homemade fritter and homemade salsa.
Yep, so what you'll see today is that we have a lot of fresh vegetables and fruits that we got from the farm or from the local farm that we toured. So what we're doing is we're going to show you a lot about how to prep these and how to get these ready and how to cut them and process them, because every fruit and every vegetable is a little bit different. And so we'll talk about how to do that. And so one of the basics of what we're going to talk about is all about how to properly use a knife. And we will say when using a knife, or if you're following along at home, make sure that you do have a caregiver with you before grabbing a knife and doing this on your own. All right, so let's see first, Jackie. I think maybe we need to check our recipes and make sure we've got everything we need here.
Absolutely. There's nothing worse than getting started on a recipe and realizing you're missing an ingredient or something that you gotta have.
Exactly. All right, so I've got my salsa recipe here, and so for my salsa recipe, it calls for a couple of tomatoes, and so I've got these over here. It calls for a red onion, so I've got a red onion here, and we'll talk about a little bit why that might be a little different, and the flavors might be a little different than regular onion. I've also got a jalapeno, so I've got that here, and then the chopped cilantro. So we actually are lucky we found some fresh cilantro today. When you're making salsa, fresh herbs are really just going to bring it over the top and make it even that much better. And then we've also got some salt and pepper and some other seasonings that we're going to throw in there. And two of the seasonings that they talk about a lot are oregano and cumin, or cumin, however you prefer to say it. And so a lot of times the cumin is going to be used in a lot of our Mexican or Hispanic dishes. They gives it that kind of that taco flavoring that you're used to, so gives it a little extra spice. So we've got all the ingredients it looks like for that, and then our fritters. So our fritters, we've got a couple ingredients we're going to need for that too. So we've got the zucchini, obviously, and we do have that, and you can use the zucchini, or you could use a regular, any kind of summer squash that you might have. We've also going to need some flour. So do we have flour ready?
Absolutely. In fact, since we've already taught them how to measure that out, I've already got it in the bowl ready to go.
All right, so we've got our all-purpose flour, and any flour will do fine for this. And then we've also got eggs. So we're going to, I see we've got an egg sitting over there, so you're going to show them how to break that egg and not get egg shell into all of our fritters, right?
That's correct.
All right. And
we want crunch from the natural cooking of that, but not from an eggshell.
Not from the eggshell. All right. And then the next thing we have is you can use either, we've got some green onion we're going to use today, or you can use some scallion. And so we're going to show you how to break this down and how to use this. And so we're going to put that in there, and then we've got a little bit of olive oil to actually help do a little light fry in the pan. And then to finish it off, we've got a little bit of light sour cream. So the light sour cream just gives it a little extra flavor on top of it that you can kind of dress it up, and we'll show you how to make it look really pretty on the plate. All right, so I think we've got everything that we need. The next thing is, I guess we need to make sure we've got all of the utensils and stuff that we need that we're going to use today. So I already talked a little bit about the knife, and so I've got my knife here. I've got two different knives. This is going to be the knife I'm going to primarily use, but you might also have a knife that we kind of call like a starter knife or a practice knife, and this one is a great one because it minimizes the amount of chance that you would get cut from while you're learning those motor skills and really getting adjusted to using a knife. So this is a good option as well. I've also got some strainers here that you'll see on the table that we're using for washing our vegetables. So everything, all the vegetables and stuff that you see here, we've already pre-washed. So it's already washed. So if you haven't washed it, you'll want to wash those ahead of time. And Mr. Jackie, tell us a little bit about the setup here of how we're going to do our fritters and what we've got.
Got you. Well, so we can show them how to do it. We've got the same hot plate that we had last time and a frying pan here. Of course, you at your house will do this on your stovetop, but this way you'll be able to see it. So we do everything right here for one easy picture to do that. I've also got a cutting board and a couple other utensils. Some of these will be necessary. Some of them are nice optional things you can have. So like I have a juicer. We're going to talk about juicing and how to get a lime ready to juice for our salsa. And then we've got some fresh cilantro, and we're going to talk about how we actually separate that and get it ready, because there's parts of it that we don't want to use because it's going to make it taste bitter. We don't want a bitter taste.
Awesome. And you'll see we have a couple of extra little utensils that we're going to use, like a whisk and maybe some spoons to stir and those types of things. And then there's one other one that when we're making our zucchini fritters, it's always good if we can get them shredded to a really fine shred. And so we've got here, we've got our grater to help us shred those up. And so I'll show you how we're going to use that in just a little bit. So it looks like we've got everything we're going to need. So I guess we're ready to get started.
Yeah, I guess now we just got to determine which one should we do first. Because, whenever we got two recipes, we mentioned that before, we got to figure out which process we should go through to make which one should be done.
All right. Yeah. So for this one, I think it's pretty easy for me to think which one we're going to do, and there's a reason why. And I think we're going to start with the salsa. And the reason is because salsa is one of those things, almost like if you make a homemade slaw or you make a potato salad or different types of salads and all, what happens is the longer they sit, if they have a little bit of time to actually sit in those juices and rest in those things, it actually lets those flavors come out even better when you actually get ready to eat it. So it's one of those things we're going to actually try to make it up real quick and give it some time to rest and sit and kind of marinate those flavors together. So I figure we'll do that one first and then do our fritter. And also too with the fritter, we want to eat that warm. So if we cook that second, we'll get to eat it warm with our salsa.
I think that's perfect. So now we know what we're doing.
All right, so that sounds good. So what we're going to do is we're going to get started, and we're going to kind of show you how we're going to process some of these different vegetables. And I'm going to start with the base of all salsa, or majority of your salsa, and that's going to be your tomato. So with a tomato, there's a couple of things. Anytime that you're getting ready to cut something, you want to assess what you think it's going to look like on the inside, and that'll determine how you're going to break it down. So for the tomato, we know that it's relatively solid. It's going to have some different seeds and some different juices and things like that on the inside, and we want to try to capture as much of that for this recipe. Whereas in some recipes, you might want to take a lot of that out and mainly just use the thicker outer coating. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get ready to break this down, and anytime you'll notice with my cutting board and my knife and those types of things, I always want to set up my area so it's nice and clean, it's nice and easy for me to use. If it's too far away from me, I want to bring it to me a little bit closer because I don't want to be reaching too far for using a knife. And then you will see one thing is I've had, the whole time we've been talking, I've had my knife sleeved so it's not got the blade end out, and I've also had it at the back of my cutting board. So anytime you're using a knife, you want it somewhere either that you can access it easily and you're not likely to accidentally cut yourself. All right, so I'm going to get ready to use this knife, and this type of knife is what we call a chef's knife. And so a chef's knife, which is much different than what Mr. Jackie has over there. He's got a paring knife. Paring knife works great for smaller items when we're trying to trim something off or to trim small items and chop. This one's mainly is a chopper. This is your workhorse of your kitchen. And when we're thinking about this, anytime you're using any knife, you want a knife that fits your hand really well. So for this one, this is a great one. It's about a 6 to 7 inch knife. It's not your full 9-inch length knife, but this is a good one because it fits good in my hand. It's light, it's comfortable. I could go for a larger knife, but for what I'm doing today, this will be perfectly fine. So anytime you're using the knife, there's a certain area that we call like the sweet spot in our kitchen, and this one is usually about a 3-inch stretch right in the middle of your knife, and that's where most of your cuts are going to be. So anything that I process or break down today, I want to get it to about that size. Because if I get it too much bigger, I'm going to be using the heel of my knife or the tip of my knife, and those places do have some purpose. but for majority of your actual chops and breaking things down, you want to use that part. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get ready to break this down. Mr. Jackie, we always teach this in our camps and our 4-H camps and things. What's the most likely hand to get cut when we're cutting?
The one that you're holding whatever you're cutting. So it's not the one that has the knife, but the opposite hand.
Exactly, because this is a lot of times the hand that we forget about. And there's a neat little way that we teach people of how to hold it and to try to save all those fingers, because we want you to have all your fingers when you leave here. So what's that little thing that we talk about all the time?
We call it the bear claw.
All right, so if you're sitting there, take and put your hand up and do the bear claw. And so what that means is I'm just going to take all my fingers and I'm turning them in. And what happens when I turn those in is now I'm less likely to actually take off a finger. And if I do anything, I'm just going to make a little bitty scrape or a little cut on my hand, which that's we don't want to do that. But if we do, that's less dangerous and less long-term impact than if we took off the tip of a finger.
Yeah, and one of the things I've noticed too, when we're working with kids the first time, it sort of feels weird for them the first time they're using the bear claw. And one of the things that they do is they forget to tuck the thumb into the bear cave, if you will, of the bear claw.
Exactly.
So that's one of the things that make sure, if you're practicing at home with your caregiver, make sure you're watching where the thumb is on that so that you're getting inside protected. So just like you're talking about, you don't only nick it and not cut it.
Exactly. Yeah, so if you can see, I'll show you a good example. So like Mr. Jackie was saying, if I forget about that thumb, when you see here, if I turn like this, you can't even see that thumb that's under there. All you can see is these fingers. So a lot of times you'll forget about it. And like you said, you'll go down through the item and go straight through your thumb, and we don't want to do that. So we'll always make sure we tuck that bear into the hole, do our bear claw here, and then we're going to come up. And this is more than, it's not as much of a hold as it is more of just a lightly graze and keeping it in place. All right, so that covers our left hand, our most dangerous hand to get cut. The next hand is how we're going to actually grip the knife. So there's a couple of ways you can do it as far as to what part of the knife. I like to grip a little bit on the blade. It gives me a little bit more control of the knife, but you're welcome to grip here. But I'm just going to make a nice little pinch grip with my index and thumb, and then I'm gonna then wrap and let these kind of naturally fall around the base, and you'll see that this is a nice flat surface. So if I was to hold the knife more like this, or if I was to hold it any more over here, I'm going to put a lot of stress on my arm. And so, Jackie, a lot of times in 4-H, a lot of these youth, they'll take this and go on and make careers of it. And so if they were to cut hundreds of bell peppers or hundreds of tomatoes in a day at a restaurant, and they didn't have the proper way of holding it, they'd put a lot of stress on the arm and it would hurt over time.
Absolutely. Learning the right skills is important, because once you learn the right way to do it, and and I have seen this with youth that you've worked with in the past, they learn those skills, and I mean, they have amazing knife skills. Skills I wish I could be as good as some of them.
Exactly, and it's one of those things that you're going to get better the more repetition you do, and it takes time to develop those skills and for it to feel normal. Now that I've got that, I've got my nice solid grip. When I get ready to cut, what I want to do is I want to go, if the item is a little bit bigger, if it's a smaller item, I can lead the tip of the knife into the cutting board. If it's a little bit larger like this, I might have to set it up here and start my cut, and then I'm going to go down and through. All right, and just like that, and then I would pivot my knife back and go down to the next one if I was going to make like a continuous chop, and you'll see that with some of the other things. But what I've done there is I just took off the end that I don't really want to eat, the little bit of the butt end of the tomato, and so I'm not going to eat this particular end. But what I will do now is, you see I've got a nice flat surface. So anytime we're cutting things, circles and round things are very difficult to cut. They roll around, they move, but flat stuff is going to stay nice in place. Puts less stress on me having to hold it here, and then I'll be able to make my next cut. So what I'm going to do for the tomato is I'm just going to go down, and I'm just going to make my cuts, and I'm trying to make these as even as possible. So with something like a salsa, if you want it to look really pretty, you don't want huge chunks and then tiny little pieces. You want to try to get them as close to each other as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up and go all the way down here, and you'll notice as I get a little bit farther, you start to see what happens is it starts to want to fall. And anytime you're cutting anything, if it wants to fall, let it fall. Because all you can do is turn it here and go back to the next one. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to try to go down, and I'm going to make strips now. So I'm going to make some strips. And when I make these strips, now they'll look like this. And I'm just going to turn them one more time because I like a nice finely chopped salsa versus a super large pieces. And then I'm going to go straight down just like this and do those cuts again. And I'm just pivoting that knife, coming back through and going down. And you might notice too, anytime that you're cutting like a tomato especially, sometimes a knife that's a little bit more serrated might work better unless you have a really sharp knife. So this knife, it's fairly sharp, but it could be a little bit sharper. And so you'll see that sometimes you won't get as clean of cuts, so you might have to go back in and fix those up a little bit at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and work through the rest of these tomatoes. And while I'm doing that, Jackie, will you show them a little bit about how to get your lime ready and maybe your cilantro too?
Absolutely. We have a fresh lime here, and what we want to do is we want to juice this lime and add it to add more moisture, and also like it's almost like helping to marinate all those delicious tomatoes and onions when we get ready. And so, since we could have bought a jar of lime juice and used that if we chose to, but we're talking about farm fresh ingredients, right? And that's some of those things we like to do. So we like fresh ingredients. So the first thing when you get a lime, if you feel it, it's pretty hard. So it's going to be hard to juice it when it's hard like this. When I was growing up, my mama, she would always talk about making lemonade, and one of the things we would do is she would take the lemons and she'd get on a hard surface and she'd use the palm of her hand and she'd roll them back and forth. And what happens is, if you can see, it starts. I can put more dents in it, because it's gotten softer just from the rolling back and forth. So I'm going to keep rolling it back and forth until I can get it nice and ready to juice, so it's going to be easy to juice. There's a couple different ways we can do this. You could just cut it in half and let the juices go, and then you'd have to worry about picking out the seeds if you do it by hand. But we also happen to have one of these little juicers right here. So I'm going to use that today just to see how it works. I'll be cutting the lime in half to make it easier. But now, if you can see, Greg, look at this. See how much easier I can push in there?
Oh, yeah.
And you can see how much it softened it up just by doing those little rows like that.
Exactly.
So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it in half. Right? And so I'm going to put my juicer right here, and I'm going to juice it directly into what we plan to actually use. So if you can see the juices squeeze out, I'm going to try to do my best to get all that delicious juice out of there. The citrus smell, I don't know if you can smell over there yet or not.
I can smell it. It smells delicious.
It's amazing. Fresh things. We've actually, in addition to using the juices, if we wanted more flavor, we could even zest the lime. You want to explain to them a little bit about what zest is?
Yeah, so zest, with the lime or with the lemon, there's different parts that we can use, and a lot of times you'll use them for different reasons. But the juice, as Mr. Jackie's just demonstrated, comes from the inside of the fruit. But on the outside, you can actually use that peel to give a very fresh, it's more one of those things that more than taste, we smell. It gives that really fresh, awesome smell to different dishes. You can use it in baked goods. You can use it for things like salsa. Or you can use it for many other recipes. And so you would just zest, and you could take a little bit off the edge of the actual peel and give that a little bit of a bitter and very strong aroma kind of to your dish. And so this particular dish doesn't call for it, but many that you might see might actually call for that.
Exactly. The other day we were doing a rub, and somebody wanted us to use some lime in it. Well, we couldn't use juice in a rub, so we actually used some of the lime zest. So if you're doing multiple recipes, maybe you used it, zest it for, I like to have it in my pancakes. It adds a really pop to that, so you could get an extra use out of limes instead of just this recipe.
Exactly.
All right, I've got the juice here. I'm going to go ahead and give this to you. I think you're fixing to have the tomatoes there.
So some tomatoes. All right.
So that way we can get those marinating, if you will.
All right.
And so, the next thing you wanted me to talk about was cilantro.
Yep.
So if you look, it's there's leaves at the very end of this, and then there's a lot of stalk here. These stems and the stalk, they're very bitter, and we don't want to have those in the salsa because we don't want that bitter taste. We want it to have a nice fresh taste. So one of the things we can do, I always just believe in pulling them off. So I'm going to go here to all the little leaves, and I'm just going to pull them off. But I'm not going to put it directly into our container yet with the tomatoes. I want to see sort of how much salsa we're going to have. Depending on how much salsa we have volume-wise, will determine how much cilantro I want to use. Because some people really love cilantro; they're going to want a bunch in it. My son, Colin, he's not a big fan of cilantro, so he wants very little, just enough to give it a little bit of flavor, but not a whole lot. So I'm going to sort of go ahead and separate it on the plate, on my cutting board here, and then we'll add it after we get all the other ingredients done, so we know how much we need to add to get the right flavor.
Exactly. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I've got two more things I need to cut up for my salsa as Mr. Jackie's getting that cilantro ready. So I've got a jalapeno, and then I've also got my my red onion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do the jalapeno, and then and for this amount of salsa, I probably wouldn't need a full jalapeno, or I wouldn't need a ton of it, because a lot of times they'll have a lot of heat in them, and you don't want too much heat for your salsa and it be overpowering. You want just enough to give it that extra little bit of pop of flavor. So what I'm going to do here is we always think about what does it look like on the inside. And this particular one, if you're not familiar with them, it's very similar to any other pepper or bell peppers. They're going to have relatively hollow core with a little bit of a pod inside that's going to have some seeds. So those seeds are probably not what we're going to want to eat. We're not going to want to eat these particular seeds. They are edible, but they don't pack a ton of flavor, so we want to actually avoid the seeds in here. And so we're going to go ahead and cut this one open, and we're going to see inside. You can start to see it kind of how it has like a little bit of a hollow, and then it has some of the pods. So then what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to go in and cut about halfway down, and now you can see the seeds are really starting to come out. So I'm going to come down, and this one I can actually smell the heat and smell the flavor that's going to come from this. So I know that I won't really need a ton because it's going to be very overpowering if I don't have or if I have too much in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull off a couple of pieces that I'm going to use. And I've got a couple little strips here, and this is about all I'll use for this salsa. So it's not a ton, but it's just a little bit to use for this salsa. All right, so what I'm going to do and the way I'm going to cut this, I'm going to lay it. This is a nice flat surface. Like we said, we like to cut flat surfaces and not round surfaces. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm just going to go back and do the same thing. I'm going to make me some nice little strips. And as you get close and you start to feel like it's a little bit dicey, you feel like your hand's a little bit too close, you can always move your hand, set your knife, move your hand away, and just go straight through by itself. Like I said, this hand is more there as a guide more than it is actually holding it. All right, so then I'm going to come back across the other way, and I'm going to make little fine dices. And you'll see I'm chopping these jalapenos nice and tiny into almost like a small mince or a very fine dice. And the reason is because when you're eating salsa or eating anything and you find the pepper, especially like jalapeno, you don't want a very big bite. So you want little pieces, because if you get a big hunk, it might be too overpowering. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do this last one. And then we'll get to our last thing that's going to be in here, and that's going to be our onion. And so we're going to use about a half of a red onion. So, Mr. Jackie, when you cook at home, do you use mostly red onions or white onions?
We use a lot of white onions. That's our favorite.
All right. And so, what kind of dishes would you use a white onion in?
Well, we do a lot of where we cook it maybe on a hamburger. Or we make a French fried onion that we could put on top of a steak, so different ways we cook it. Maybe fried potatoes and onions, so most of the time we're cooking with them. If you think about it, a lot of times those white onions, we're doing some sort of cooking with them.
Cooking, yeah. And so you'll see white onions a lot in things that you're going to cook. Whereas a red onion, you typically will see red onions a lot of times in uncooked dishes. So you can cook red onions. They'll go in different things that are cooked. But a lot of times you'll see them in like salads, or you'll see them in different salsas or different fresh ingredients where they're not going to be cooked. And the red onion has a little bit different taste. It has a little bit different aroma about it versus your standard yellow or white onion that you might get to do your other dishes. So this particular recipe, it calls for about a half of an onion. And with onions, how we're going to break them down depends a lot on how I want to cut it up and what I want to do. So onions in here, it's basically a solid thing, but it's got the layers all the way through it. And so it's basically just all the way down. So this outer layer here was once not as dry. It was a much hardier layer, but as it gets exposed, it dries out. And so what I want to make sure I do is that I have a plan before I start. So for this particular one, I'm going to try to keep a uniform, nice chop like we've done with everything else. If I was going to do like a fajitas or something like that, I would make it into strips. And so for what we're going to do, what I'm going to start with, and if you'll notice, did I watch this one, Mr. Jackie?
No, you did not.
Yeah, so this is one of the few produce things that you actually don't have to wash, because what you're going to do is when I cut this, I'm going to actually peel off and take that outer layer off. So I'm physically removing the potential contaminants and bacteria off the top.
So would this be like eating a banana? You wouldn't peel a banana, wash a banana before you ate it because you're going to take out the peel.
Exactly, perfect example. So I'm going to start, and the onion will have two ends. It'll have the head end here, and it'll have like your root end. We want to try to keep that root intact for what we're going to do here, and I'll show you why in a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and take this portion off here, off the top. I'm just going to go straight down. If you notice, I haven't even started peeling yet. Now, it might start peeling a little bit on its own, but I haven't started the peeling process. And I'll show you why in a second. Because if you've ever tried to peel an onion and try to pick all of these little pieces off, they can be quite annoying, and you can get them everywhere. But what you see is I'll come here, and now that I've got it opened up, and you'll see what it looks like, I can actually pick back and find the next layer that's going to come off, that naturally will come off, and I can peel it straight back, and it comes off really easy, and I don't have to worry about getting all those little tiny dry layers off onto my cutting board and everywhere else. And so I'll go ahead and take that one off, and now I've got a pretty color, and also too with onions, especially in something like a salsa, you see how vibrant the color is, and so it's going to really pop in that salsa. Because remember, like we say always, we eat first with our eyes. All right.
That's exactly what I was thinking when you were talking about when you started taking it out. Those colors are popping.
Exactly. So, so now that I've got it here, you can actually see this root end. It's actually got like a little bit of a darker indentation at the top here, and that lets you know how far you have before you hit the root. And so we don't actually want to eat the root part, but we'll want to come back somewhere around in here, so we can eat all the way up until that area, and then we won't use this last little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to make some lines along the lines that are naturally there. And what I'm doing is I'm going to try to go through that onion, but I don't want to go all the way through it. So I don't want to go all the way to the back of the root. And that's what I'm going to try to do. And this is where you actually will use the tip of your knife. So I'm going to come here, same kind of grip and everything, and I'm just going to follow those lines as a guide. And I'm trying to make them roughly, if you see here, you can see it's not all the way through. And they're roughly all about the same size, and it follows the guide of what we use for our tomato and all those things. So they're all about that same size. So I'm going to keep going down, straight down through. And if you go all the way through, no worries. You can grab and put it back together, and it'll work just fine. But I'll show you why it's so important in a second, because we're going to make another cut too. All right, so I've still got it. It's still all intact. I can pick it all the way up. But now I'm going to go through and I'm going to cut back this way. And what I've done is basically when we made those strips with our tomato, or tried to get into those strips with our jalapeno, it's naturally made strips and they're all together. So it makes cutting, less cuts, the better. So I'm going to come back here and I'm going to try to make around the same size all the way down. All right. And you'll see how it just naturally gets us into the perfect dice that we're looking for.
It's amazing. It's like the onion's holding itself together for you by using that root that way.
Exactly. And that's, for our salsa here, this might actually be a little bit too much onion. So I'm not going to use all of this, but I'll use a good bit of it. But if you notice and you look here, you'll see some pieces are a little bit bigger. Some pieces might not be perfect. So what you can do is you can come in, especially for something where you don't want huge bites, just like with the jalapeno, you don't want big bites of onion. And I can come back in, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to naturally do a nice little chop all the way across. So I'll set my knife and I'm just going to come back across just like this. And these three hands, I'm not putting pressure, I'm not doing it. It's just a nice little resting guide so I can keep it going through. And I'm just doing the same motion, the down and through, down and through. All right, so I'm going to come through here and I'm just going to give them a nice little light chop because they're about right. I see a couple of long pieces I want to get. All right. And there we go. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer and I'm going to put a little bit of my onion into here. All right, and I might use a little bit more. Some of these perfect cut pieces. All right, so there we go. So now we have that ready. So what else do we need now?
Well, let's see. We haven't added the cilantro. Is there anything else that was on that recipe that we need to add? Any seasonings at all?
Yeah, so I think we're gonna add our cilantro and then we're gonna add our seasoning. So we've got a little bit of salt and pepper. a little bit of the cumin, and a little bit of oregano is all we're going to add. So if you want to go ahead and put a little bit of the cilantro in there, I'd say probably about half of that will be about right.
Well, some of these leaves look like they're bigger than others. Do you think I should do a little fine chop like you just did to sort of try to get them as evenly as possible?
Yep, that might work really good.
Okay.
So just a nice little fine chop, and similar kind of thing. You don't want an overwhelming bite or too much. You just want a nice little bite. All right.
I think that'll do it. Of course, you can always just tear it up with your hands. I'm just looking what we got here. My goal is just to get a little bit on the top so I don't overwhelm it with cilantro flavor. All right, Mr. Greg, what do you think? Does that look about right?
Oh yeah, that looks good. I think that's going to work just right.
You know, and something too, once you start cooking with herbs, if you like cooking with herbs, we can teach you actually how to actually grow your own herbs. And that's something you might want to think about so you can go out and pull them out. We have a rosemary bush at my house. Use it all the time to cook and actually add to brines and such to add some flavor.
Exactly. Yeah, fresh herbs are much easier to grow than some of the other things are, and they're also a great way to have continuous fresh seasonings for your foods.
And we have somebody in the extension office that can help you learn how to grow different herbs. So.
Yep. All right. So now we've got everything in there that we need. What we're going to do now is I'm going to throw in a little bit of salt, pepper, and a little bit of our seasonings. So whenever you get ready to get to this point, and you're starting to think of what you're going to, how much seasoning you need, it's one of those things where you have to start to kind of eyeball it. And I would say this is a great recipe when you're making it, especially if it's the first time or your first couple times making it. You might not know exactly how much of everything to put in there, but what you can do is you can taste test it as you go. So you put a little bit of seasoning in, test it. If it needs a little more, you can adjust. So for this one, it's a little bit easier because we've made this recipe a couple times, so I kind of know about where I want to go with it. And I'm just going to try to eyeball about what I'm looking for. So I'm going to put a little bit of the oregano flakes in there. The cumin, it's one of those, it's a great seasoning. I don't need a ton, but I need enough just to give it a pop. And then for my salt and pepper, I like a little bit of extra salt because I feel like salt brings out all those nice flavors and all that stuff that we brought in there. And then we just need a tad bit of pepper because we already got a little bit of heat in there from our jalapenos. All right, so I've got that together, and now what I'll do is I'll just give it a nice little toss, and I'm going to let that juice, that fresh squeezed lime juice, come around. And you'll see, and this particular salsa is more of what we call like a pico or Pico De Gallo. And so this is a little bit chunkier salsa, and this is the kind I really like. So this one's great for serving with chips, as we'll show you in a little bit. But this is a great recipe that you could actually put on top of a piece of chicken and actually bake in the oven, and it would turn out really, really good and give you a lot of flavor to a different dish.
If somebody wanted to have theirs more like a picante sauce, which is more liquidy, if they had a food processor, would that work to help break it down more?
Yeah, so what you can do is if you want it to be that smoother consistency, you can break it down with a food processor. You could also actually add a little bit of, you can get like a can of diced tomatoes that are cooked, and you can actually put those in there. And what that does, that adds a little bit more liquid, gives you a little bit different composition, and it'll have a little bit more of that flavor. But to really get that really smooth consistency, you're going to have to put it in some form of blender to chop it up.
Yeah, one of the things I always like about a recipe, the first time we make a new recipe, I like to try it exactly the way it was done, and then I want to work it to my taste, So
exactly.
It's always good to start out the way it was designed to be done.
Yep, exactly. So I'm going to put this here so you can see the salsa, and then we're going to get ready and move stuff around a little bit and get ready for our second recipe.
Sounds good. I'll go ahead and move this around.
All right. So for our second recipe, this is the one that we mentioned at the beginning with the zucchini fritter. So what's a fritter, Mr. Jackie?
Well, let's see. It's almost like a hash brown, or if you think of something, it's a fried vegetable.
Yeah, so a fritter can be many different things. So you might have heard of apple fritters, or you might have heard of zucchini fritters, or you might have heard of many different types. Potato fritters, and like you said, a hash brown can be a version of like a fritter. But the main thing is they basically all kind of have similar ingredients. They're going to have something that's going to hold it all together. In this case, it'll be our egg. They're going to have a little bit of flour, most likely, to give it a little bit of that crunchy, that texture, and kind of that natural breading. And then it's going to have whatever your base is. And so for our base for this one, we're going to use zucchini. So during the summer in around here in North Carolina, you can get plenty of fresh summer squash, zucchini, as well as yellow squash also too. So what we're going to do is we're going to get ready to do this one, and the same kind of thing. I'm going to make sure I read through my recipe so I know exactly when I'm putting stuff in and exactly what process I'm going to be doing. All right, so with this recipe, just to make sure I've got my ingredients, we've got our egg, we've got our flour, we got our zucchini. You've got your oil, so we can actually cook it in the pan, and then I've got my sour cream over here. And the sour cream, like I said, is something we're gonna use as a kind of a finishing touch at the very end. All right, so the first thing we got to do is we got to get our zucchini shredded. All right, so with our zucchini, it looks like this. It's a solid squash, so it's solid all the way through, and I've got to get it shredded. Now, I could shred it with a knife, so I could make it and cut into lots of tiny little pieces, which might take me quite a long time. Or if you have it at your home, you can actually use a shredder or use a grater. And so this is one that you might have seen, your guardian or someone using before for cheese, to grate cheese out. So if you had a block of cheese, and so we're going to use that for our zucchini. But one thing I do want to do is I'm not going to eat the ends off of here. Just because they don't have a ton of flavor. It's one of those things that you want to take off before we start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just take my knife and just make 2 little cuts and just take those ends off. All right, so now I've got those ends off. I'm ready to go. All right, so Mr. Jackie, when I'm grating here, is this thing sharp or is this thing dull?
Oh, it's sharp, all right. It can get your fingers, and you have to treat it with the same respect you would a knife.
Exactly. So this is one of those tools that you always want to think about, because I feel like people are more likely to get cut on this sometimes than they would be even using a knife. And when I'm using this, I want to make sure that I have a good solid surface, and I've got something that's not going to move away from me as I'm shredding down here. And for these particular ones, and I'm going to move my cutting board just so I've got a little bit more space and a little bit sturdier base. And when I'm doing these, what I'm doing, you'll see I've got, I'm holding it with my hand. But when you're at home, if you're a little uncomfortable with it or a little unsure, feel free to take and put your fork in here and use your fork to grate all the way down. All right? And so, and I'll show you, especially when we get to the bottom, why that's going to be so important. But I'm just pushing a little bit of pressure, not a ton, and we're just going down, and I'm trying to grate this.
Mr. Gary, notice on there's actually 2 different size holes on the grater. At the top is a bigger hole, and at the bottom is a smaller hole. Why are you using the top and not the bottom?
Yeah, so I'm using the top because of the size of what I'm doing. So this is a large item, and I don't want it to get it too fine. I like a little bit of texture in my fritter. So by having the little bit bigger pieces, I'll get some of that natural zucchini texture. Whereas if I want a little bit smaller, it would end up getting almost to a mush in a way.
Gotcha. Yeah, it reminds me of if I'm doing a potato for a hash brown or something, it's sort of giving you that same type of texture and that same type of feel.
Yep. This is how they make hash browns when you don't buy them in the store in a bag.
That's right.
All right. So as I'm getting closer to the end, I'm going to switch over, and like I said, as I get a little bit closer, I can always come in and I can put my fork into the zucchini, and now I can go, and I don't have to worry quite as much about my hand getting too close to that grate and cutting myself. So I'm just going to continue to go on down. All right, Mr. Jackie, when I'm doing this and this zucchini is coming out, is this a really dry looking zucchini, or has it got water in it? What's it look like?
I think there is a lot of water in that zucchini, because I could just see the moisture as you're almost grinding it coming out of it.
Exactly. So we've talked about before that a lot of these vegetables have lots of water in them. So they have tons of water that are in these. And so for this particular recipe, this is one that we're not going to want too much water. Because if I have too much water, what would happen when I tried to fry these fritters up?
Well, you can never get something crisp if it's got a lot of water in it. So that because it's going to want to steam, it's going to want to make it soft, and so you got to get rid of that moisture if you want it to get crispy.
Exactly. So, so I know you might not be able to see it here, but if you're doing this at home, you'll definitely be able to feel a lot of the moisture that's in there. And so one thing that you'll see is we've got it on a paper towel, and what we do with that, and we've got it into a natural grate to help it drain. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to fold the paper towel over, and I'm going to naturally press down and use that that pressure and that grate to help get some of that moisture out. And as I'm getting that moisture out, I'm able to dry it out so that we can get a really good fry on what we're looking for.
Yeah, sometimes you may have to do this process twice, depending on how wet your zucchini is, to really get it all that moisture out.
Yep, and another thing that you'll see with this is if you buy like chopped spinach in your freezer section, a lot of times you'll have to do this same kind of thing before you put it in different recipes. All right, so as this is getting done, you can see how it really soaks up into that paper towel, and so I can take it out here, and I can get a much drier consistency that's going to work great for my fritters.
Yeah, I mean you can just see how much moisture, even some of the color from the zucchini is trapped on that paper towel.
Exactly. So we've actually went ahead and measured out and dried out because it says in our recipe that we want to let it sit for about 10 minutes, and this just helps kind of that drying out process before we get ready to throw it into the next step. So so this one is nice and dry. This one has had some time to sit, and this gives us our 2 cups of zucchini for our fritters. All right.
Now, if we were making a smaller batch, could we cut this recipe in half?
Yeah, so funny you should ask. I actually already did that and didn't even tell you.
Oh, okay, cool. Because we don't have a whole lot of mouths to feed. We wish y'all were here with us to try these out, but we figured we probably couldn't eat all that this was going to make, right?
Yep, exactly. So typically we would make normally 4 cups of this, and we'd have double the eggs and double the amount of flour. So we've actually cut the recipe down based on, like you said, our size of how many people we have here, because we don't want to waste too much. All right, so next steps, it tells me here that I've got to combine these things and get them stirred up. So one thing I don't have ready is I don't have my egg ready. So you think you could show us that neat trick you showed me that time of how to get that egg just right with no eggshell?
Absolutely. Let me get this so I can capture my egg here. We had a chef when we did the Chef in the Child program when I was a 4-H agent for South County, and he showed me the proper way to open an egg. And so a lot of people, they'll say, I'm just going to crack it on the side of the cup or bowl that they're doing, but that could lead to where you have egg running outside on the outside, and so you can have a cross-contamination. So he basically showed me just taking a regular butter knife and trying to go towards the center of the egg, just come down with one, hear that nice crack, and then all I do is I go right through there, and got a perfect cracked egg. No shell in there because we don't want any egg in there. So now I can just put this on my paper towel and take it to the trash can.
Awesome. And you'll notice too, Mr. Jackie, once he disposes of that, he's going to go ahead and wash up his hands. And we talked about this last time. But anytime you're working with raw ingredients like raw eggs or you're working with raw meats, we have that risk of cross-contamination. So we want to make sure we're washing our hands after handling this. Even though he might only got a little bit on there, we don't want to transfer that to, say, our fresh salsa that we're never going to cook. So we don't want that risk of cross-contamination. All right, so now that he's got that ready, he's going to get ready and whisk that up in a minute. And I'm going to show you kind of what we've got working here and what we're going to plan to do. So I've got a little bit of, I've got my zucchini, I've got my flour already in here. You can do these a little bit different way. This particular recipe, we're going to combine it all in there and mix it all together. But sometimes you might find that when you're light frying things or that you're making a fritter, that you might actually bread it at the end. So it might actually be like a dip the mixture into the bread. But for this particular one, it's going to mix all together. All right, so I think we're ready to go. I'm going to whisk that up real quick.
We're going to get it on the side so I can get a better whisk on it.
Oh, perfect.
And I went with a nice deep dish too, so that way I knew I didn't have to worry about slinging anything out on the outside. And I think that looks like a perfect whisk.
That looks great. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and take this. And while I'm getting this mixed up and get it set up, I think we're going to do these over medium-high heat. So do you want to go ahead and get the skillet going?
Absolutely.
All right.
All right.
All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and pour my mixture together, get everything ready to go.
While you're mixing that up, I might show, if you're cooking on a stovetop with a pan, we always want to keep your handles to the side so that you're less likely to spin it or knock it off. So if you can see, we've got that done here where it's off to the side and not where we might hit it with our chest or our hands as we're working with something. So one of the safety things you might want to make sure you do if you're cooking at home on the stovetop.
Great advice. All right, so I'm getting these nice and mixed up. Add a little bit more of my zucchini. All right. So what would happen, Mr. Jackie, if we just had these, mixed these up and just threw them right in there and that pan was cold?
If you throw it in right there on that cold pan, it's just going to sit there and sit there, and you're like, is it ever going to start? And you're not going to get that crispness you're looking for. If you want a crispy fritter, you got to let that pan get hot. You know, think about like a steak that's going onto a grill. If you want grill marks, you got to let the actual grill grates that you're cooking on get hot. And so the same thing, we got to let this pan get hot so we get that sear on there to make it crunchy.
Exactly. So when you put it in there, you should hear a little bit of a sizzle or some kind of sizzle when you get ready to do that. You'll also notice that he hadn't put his oil in quite yet. He's letting his pan heat up a little bit, because if we put the oil in right away and then heat the pan up and maybe we have to do a couple other things and it sits there for a little bit, then there's a chance that our oil could start to burn a little bit or get a little rancid.
And I've always heard this saying, hot pan, cool oil, no stick.
There you go, exactly. All right, so I've got this ready. This mixture is looking great. I think it's ready to make some really good looking fritters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and move this over to the side so Jackie will be ready to go. And you'll see that the size of your fritter is kind of up to you. So you could do very large like cake style fritters, or you can make little bites if you're doing like for hors d'oeuvres or something like that. We're going to use a little scoop, and the biggest thing is that you want to have them relatively the same size. So you don't want big ones and a little tiny one, and so just for presentation purposes. So he's going to use this scoop, and that's going to give him roughly about maybe a couple tablespoons, 3 tablespoons maybe, which is what the recipe calls for. All right, so while he's doing that and he's getting that pan ready, before he gets ready to put in his oil and all, one thing that we're going to do at the end here is we're going to have we're going to talk about presentation and how we're going to make this actually look really pretty on the plate. And one of the things that I'm going to do with that is I'm actually going to pull out a little bit of green onion. And so green onion, it'll have a little bit of flavor, but it's not like overpowering. But what it does have is has a nice, pretty green color. So when I have this fritter finished at the end, and I put a little bit of this sour cream on and drop a couple of those pretty looking onions on top, it's going to look really, really good and look really tasty. So it'll wow your guest if you're cooking for others.
I think my pan is ready.
All right.
All right, I'm going to add just a little bit of oil. I've almost got a little smoke coming there. That's good. That's what we want. Nice hot pan. There's our cool oil. And now I'm going to just move my pan around a little bit to spread the oil around. And I'm going to do one fritter at a time because I want these to be as unique and special as possible. If I put too many in there, I'm afraid I might overcrowd my pan.
And I'm not sure if you can pick it up and hear it, but when he put that in there, it had a nice sizzle. It had a nice little sear. So that lets me know his pan's ready. If he was to put it in there and it had no sizzle or anything, it would mean his pan's not quite hot enough, and he's probably not going to get the texture that he's looking for this fritter.
I can already see on the edges over here where it's starting to brown up just a little bit already on the edges. So,
all right. While we're waiting, I'm gonna give my salsa another little toss just to kind of help those juices marinate. All right.
And Greg, how do we know when it's the right time to turn a fritter? Because if you turn it too soon, what might happen?
Yeah, so if you turn it too soon, you might not have actually let it time to set up, and you might fall apart really bad. As well as I always think about when you cook things in the pan, especially if you're cooking like a flat thing or some kind of flat thing like a steak, or you're cooking a large piece of something like a fritter, you pretty much want to flip one time. It's not something that you want to be flipping back and forth and back. It's a one-time flip. So it's always good to go a little bit longer than maybe you think, but you can start to see in your pan, maybe at home, you'll see right around the edges, you'll start to get a little bit of browning, and you'll get a little bit of of like that golden brown color coming around the outside. And if you have to, as Mr. Jackie will show you in a minute, he can actually put his spatula in there and check a little bit just to see if it's starting to get hard.
Yeah, I'm going to turn my action spatula upside down and sort of use that extra height by doing it that way. And I can feel it's sliding around as one piece. So I think it's definitely ready to turn. So I'm going to come in here.
Oh yeah.
And look at that color.
Yeah, that's perfect color. So you want that nice golden brown color, and it's mixing with that green on the inside. It's going to be perfect. All right. So
now, how long does it say we're supposed to cook these again?
Yeah, so these, depending on the size of them, are basically only a couple minutes on each side. So your total time for per fritter will probably be 2 to 3 minutes a side. So basically maybe 5 minutes and you're done. So these aren't going to take too long to cook. We're just wanting to get that egg cooked through that we had set in and get that nice crisp on that outside. All right.
And if I had a bigger fry pan, I might actually be doing, like the next time I might try 2. I just want to make sure my pan was right for this first one. So I'll try 2 the second time, see if I can get it good. But you need to have, you want to think about how big your pan is, how many you put in there. Because if you overcrowd your pan, it's harder to flip them. And also it's harder to keep the pan hot with lots in there.
Exactly. And I've noticed over here you've got a paper towel on your plate that you have that you're going to transfer it to. And why is that?
Well, we want to eat something that's delicious, but if it's just soaking in oil, it's not going to taste great. So what this is going to help us do is remove any excess oil from the pan fry. We're not doing a deep fry, so it's not, we're just doing a slight pan fry, and I'm trying to use just a little bit of oil, but I want to remove any excess oil that we don't need, and this is going to help do that so that when it goes onto a plate, it's going to be perfect.
And this will help you to actually keep it nice and crispy too, because if you sit fried goods out for too long, a lot of times those oils and things will sit in it, and it'll lose some of that crispiness to it.
Oh, it's almost there.
Almost there. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and clear my station up a little bit and get ready so I can show you how we're going to plate these to wow your guests. All right.
All right, this one's ready to come off.
All right.
Set that there for just a second.
Yeah, and we'll let that one rest a little bit. And Jackie, you want to hand me a plate so I can show them how to set it up on a plate?
And I'm going to tell you what, I want to go ahead and give you the chips and salsa in case you want to try the salsa, in case we need to add any extra flavors to it as well.
Awesome. Sounds good. All right. So we've got our chips here. We've got our fritters sitting there resting. And so now we need to think about like how we would plate something like this. So when we get ready to plate things, it's very important to have a nice, clean, pretty looking presentation. And so if I was going to do something like this with my salsa and my chips, what I would probably do is I'd come in and I'd put a little bit of my salsa on one side. And sometimes with salsa, it works better to eat out of a bowl. But for this purposes, we're just going to put a little bit on our plate. And so I'm going to put a little bit of my salsa on my plate. And then I'm going to come here and I'm going to get some of my chips. And I'm just going to arrange them so that it looks nice and pretty and it would be inviting to come and eat. All right, so I'm going to put a couple of chips, and always think about when you plate something that it makes sense together. So if I've got 2 chips for all that salsa, it might not make a lot of sense. Or if I have a whole plate full of chips and I've only got a tablespoon of salsa, it's just not going to work. So think about the practicality of eating it as well. So anytime you plate something, make sure it's going to function to eat. All right, it looks like that fritter's ready to go in here too. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this fritter and I'm going to transfer it over, and I can feel it's got a nice crisp on it. So Mr. Jackie did a really good job getting it ready. And I've got it on my plate. It looks pretty already, but let's see if we can do a little bit better. All right, because the 4-H motto is we want to make the best better, right, Jackie?
That's right.
All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to get a little bit of my sour cream, and I'm just going to try to put a little dollop right there on the center. A little more. All right, and then I'm going to come back and I've actually got some of my fresh green onions, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to get just a couple, and I'm just going to try to get them to sit nice and pretty on the top, just like that. All right, so now that we've got our dish complete, we're ready to eat, and we hope you enjoy these recipes and try them at home, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.